The U.S. president has threatened 100% tariffs on Canada, but our prime minister and the American leader did speak on the phone on Monday to sort out their issues. Let's go to John Weeks on this, member of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Marilla.
Did you take those new tariff threats seriously?
No, not really. I must say, I think if you take everything Donald Trump says seriously, you'd become a very poor sleeper.
Okay, we know that, or it sounds like Donald Trump took the remarks by our prime minister at Davos quite seriously, or at least to heart, which may have prompted him to threaten that tariff. And I'm wondering what that fine line would be for Carney, where he says he didn't walk back what he said, but he still needs to have the president work with him.
Well, I think the fundamentals are that were really laid out by the prime minister in his speech in Davos. And I think going forward with the United States, we hope we'll be able to successfully conclude a good review of the NAFTA, which will lead to its continuation for a number of years. But I think it's to make that should not be the only goal we're trying to seek. Given the uncertainty that Donald Trump has created, I think it's critical that we go ahead with the program that's been identified for the government for strengthening the Canadian economy and diversifying trade relations. And frankly, diversifying trade is in some senses a goal, but we won't get there without strengthening our economy and beginning to really produce things that the world wants. We do have things that the world wants, but they're largely in the ground. And we're going to have to figure out how to make our economy more active, how to make it more dynamic, and how to actually begin to produce things again.
Okay, let me ask you first if you think there's any merit to American concerns that Canada becomes a dumping ground for Chinese goods that then make their way into the U.S. This is one of the allegations from the U.S. Since Canada has signed, or at least come to an agreement with China on reducing tariffs.
I often think it's a mistake to try and parse Donald Trump's tweets, but in this case, given that he's threatening 100% tariffs, I think it's probably a good idea to look at it quite carefully. And you've just identified the fact that he talked about Canada as he calls it Trump called it in his post a drop-off port for China to send goods and products to the United States. And quite clearly, what was agreed with China a couple of weeks ago is not anything that would allow that to happen. And in fact, any Chinese goods which come into Canada aren't going to go on to the United States unless they get through the United States customs. And to do that, they're going to have to demonstrate that they comply with the rules of origin of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, the CUSMA. So there's no threat here of products coming in under the tariff deal we've just done with the Chinese that are then going to go on into the U.S. market. It's just not going to happen. It's not real. So in a sense, if he predicates his remarks on that, then we can already begin to relax a bit because that's not going to happen. And then, of course, he conditions the 100% on if Canada makes a deal with China. And I think in Trump parlance, a deal isn't just changing a few tariffs. A deal is really something more like a free trade agreement. And quite clearly, the prime minister has said, we have no intention of negotiating a free trade agreement with China. And I think that's probably absolutely correct, not for any very long foreseeable future.
Yeah, so that was the interpretation of Ottawa, as you mentioned. But Canada is now talking about sending more energy products to India. One of our team, we have a team there now. Of course, the China agreement. I'm wondering whether you think Canada is partnering with the right nations on this path to diversification.
Well, I think it's very, very hard to decide in commercial transactions who you're going to partner with, especially if you have an objective of diversifying your trade and trying to increase exports to countries other than the United States by 50% over 10 years. I think we have to do it, as the Prime Minister said, we're going to have to take the world as it is and not as we would wish it to be. of course, we're not going to do things that are going to damage international security, but I don't think we will sit down and do a moral profile of all of our trading partners before we decide whether we want to export to them.
You touched on CUSMA renegotiations supposed to happen this year. Do you think we are headed for a new deal or bilateral agreements with the USA and Mexico?
Well, I think, a lot of people are talking about the deadline of July 1, as if, everything had to be decided by July 1. But under the agreement, July 1 is the date for the start of the review process, the formal review process. And so, and part of that review process has to be a discussion about whether or not the parties wish to extend the agreement for a further 16-year period. And if they don't reach agreement on this in the course of, the review process, however that long lasts, then they don't, and they decide not to extend the agreement then, well, it goes on for another 10 years until it expires. So there's lots of time to have further discussion about how to continue the agreement. Yeah. And in fact, the agreement itself provides for a review every year if the first year's review isn't successful.
Okay.
So this agreement is in force until 2036.
All right.
Unless the Americans decide to use withdrawal clause and leave the agreement.
I have to interrupt. I'm sorry, we're just run out of time, John, but
right.
I do appreciate you joining us on the topic. Thanks for that.